It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Jamal Carter stepped into the corner convenience store on Maple Street. He wasn't looking for anything special, just a quick snack before heading to a business meeting across town. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, bringing with him a damp breeze and the faint smell of rain-soaked asphalt. The store looked the same as it had years ago when Jamal was a teenager in the neighborhood. The same flickering fluorescent lights, the same aisles cluttered with dusty cereal boxes and candy bars. But this time Jamal wasn't the same boy who used to come here with loose change in his pocket. He was a grown man now, a successful entrepreneur dressed neatly in a tailored navy blue suit, watch glinting under the dull lights. Yet, despite the polished exterior, he could feel it, that look. It started the moment he stepped past the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged white man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl, barely glanced up from his phone before narrowing his eyes. Jamal felt the weight of suspicion follow him like a shadow. As he moved down the aisle, pretending to browse, he could hear the faint squeak of shoes behind him. Every time he turned, the clerk turned too. When Jamal paused at the chips, the man suddenly appeared at the end of the row, pretending to restock shelves that clearly didn't need restocking. When Jamal moved to the drink section, the clerk shifted again, this time pretending to tidy up a display. Jamal didn't need to guess what was happening. He had seen this movie before. It was the same silent accusation that had followed him through life, in stores, restaurants, and even corporate offices. The same distrustful glare that said, "You don't belong here." He picked up a bottle of water and a granola bar, keeping his composure. But inside, something twisted. It wasn't just anger. It was exhaustion. He was tired of having to prove, over and over, that he wasn't a threat, that his skin wasn't a warning sign. When he approached the counter, the clerk's expression tightened further. He stared at Jamal's hands, his clothes, his watch. Every small detail, searching for something wrong. Jamal handed him the items. The clerk hesitated before scanning them, then said nothing as he bagged them with slow, deliberate movements. When Jamal handed him a crisp $50 bill, the man held it up to the light, checking for counterfeiting. The insult was silent but deafening. Jamal waited, face calm, heart steady. Years of experience had taught him how to control the storm within. When the transaction was done, he took the bag, thanked the man softly, and walked out into the rain. But as the door closed behind him, he knew something had changed. Because this wasn't just any store. This was one of the several retail locations his company had recently acquired through a merger. The paperwork had been finalized only a week ago. And within the next month, Jamal Carter would officially be listed as the new owner of this very business. The same one whose clerk had just treated him like a criminal. As he stood under the gray sky, the irony settled in like thunder rumbling in the distance. The store that saw him as a suspect would soon be his responsibility. The man who had followed him around like a thief would soon answer to him. But Jamal wasn't the kind of man who believed in petty revenge. No. His kind of justice was quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. He didn't want to humiliate anyone. He wanted to teach, to make people see what they had chosen not to see. That night, as he reviewed business reports at home, his mind replayed the encounter again and again. The eyes that accused, the tone that dismissed, the dignity stripped away by a single look. It wasn't the first time he had experienced racism. But it might be the last time he ever let it go unaddressed. The next day, he called his management team. There were changes he wanted to implement in all their stores. Training programs, policy revisions, culture reforms. He didn't explain the reason just yet. He wanted to visit the Maple Street store in person first, this time as the man in charge. And as he closed his laptop that night, rain tapping softly against the window, he made a silent promise to himself. That store would never treat anyone else the way it had treated him. And soon, the clerk would realize exactly who he had followed through those aisles. The truth was coming, and with it, a lesson he would never forget. A week later, Jamal stood once again before the small convenience store on Maple Street. The morning sun filtered through the clouds, painting streaks of gold on the wet pavement. The same flickering sign buzzed faintly, the same bell still hung above the door. But this time, Jamal wasn't just another customer. He was walking into a business he owned. Inside, the air smelled of cheap coffee and floor cleaner. The clerk from before, Rick, as Jamal had learned from the employee files, stood behind the counter, flipping through receipts. He didn't look up at first, too busy grumbling to himself about a supplier order. Jamal took a moment to observe him quietly. The man was perhaps in his mid-40s, the kind of person who looked like the world had worn him down, but who still carried himself with an air of undeserved superiority. Jamal noticed the little things. The help wanted sign taped to the counter. The faded, "We reserve the right to refuse service" plaque angled just so that customers couldn't miss it. And most of all, the way Rick's eyes finally lifted, narrowing ever so slightly as they met Jamal's. That familiar look. Suspicion, judgment, disbelief. Jamal could almost read his thoughts. What's he doing here again? But Jamal didn't react. Instead, he calmly walked through the aisles, mentally taking note of inventory issues, expired stock, and sloppy shelf organization. His training and experience as a businessman kicked in automatically, analyzing every detail with quiet precision. He saw it clearly now. This store wasn't just failing in attitude, it was failing in operation. The systems were outdated, the staff unmotivated, and the customer experience unwelcoming. It was the perfect example of how a toxic culture infects every part of a business, from its profits to its people. When he finished his silent inspection, Jamal approached the counter again. Rick pretended to be busy. The same tension filled the air as before, that unspoken message. "You don't belong here." But this time, Jamal's calm wasn't just self-control. It was power. He knew something Rick didn't. He wasn't a customer being watched anymore. He was an owner observing his employees' behavior. As Jamal walked out of the store, he made a mental note to arrange a full management meeting. But before that, he wanted to test something. He wanted to know whether this was an isolated problem or a reflection of the company culture as a whole. Over the next week, he visited 3 other store branches under disguise, each in a different neighborhood. The results were sobering. At 2 locations, he was greeted with warmth and respect. But at the third, the pattern repeated. A young black man automatically assumed to be trouble. The clerk's tone, the stares from other customers, even the subtle body language, all carried that same poison. It became clear to Jamal that this wasn't just about one man named Rick. It was about what people believed when no one was watching. About how prejudice hides under politeness until it slips out in moments of bias. Back at his office, Jamal gathered the reports, financial statements, and HR logs. But something else caught his eye. A complaint form submitted by a previous employee months earlier. It was unsigned but detailed. The writer claimed that Rick had a history of discriminating against customers of color and even made rude comments about the kind of people who came from that side of town. The company's previous leadership had dismissed the report, marking it insufficient evidence. Jamal set the paper down slowly. The anger returned, not loud or fiery, but heavy and deliberate. It wasn't about what had happened to him personally anymore. It was about everyone who had probably walked into that store and been treated the same way. He decided it was time for a visit, not as a customer, not even as a silent observer, but as the new CEO. The next morning, Jamal scheduled a district meeting at the Maple Street store. He wanted every employee there, including Rick. When the day arrived, Rick came to work as usual, unaware of what was about to unfold. He chatted with a coworker, complaining about customers and his low pay. Then he heard it. The sound of unfamiliar voices, suits, and name tags walking through the door. His manager, the regional director, and behind them, a tall man with calm confidence in his stride. Rick froze when their eyes met. There was something unnervingly familiar about the stranger. The regional director announced that the new CEO would be inspecting all stores personally as part of a company-wide initiative. Rick's expression faltered when he heard the name, Jamal Carter. He stared, recognition dawning too late. The same man he had followed through the aisles, the same man he had treated like a potential thief, was now standing in front of him, watching him with quiet, steady eyes. In that moment, Rick's smirk vanished. He looked small, exposed. Jamal didn't gloat. He didn't even speak. He simply nodded to his team to begin the assessment. As they reviewed the files, questioned staff, and inspected operations, Rick's nerves began to show. He fumbled through explanations, made excuses, tried to justify why his store's performance was lagging. Jamal said nothing, but his silence was louder than words. By the end of the inspection, Rick was sweating. The truth of the situation settled in. His new boss wasn't just another executive. He was the man he had once looked down upon. And as the team left the store, Jamal turned one last time. His eyes met Rick's, calm but unflinching. the weight of poetic justice hanging in the air. For Rick, the realization was suffocating. For Jamal, it was only the beginning. Because what came next wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about accountability. And soon, every employee in the company would be forced to confront the same question Rick had just faced. What happens when the people you judge end up holding the power you never thought they could have? The following week brought a quiet storm to the company. Rumors spread quickly after Jamal's visit to the Maple Street store. Employees whispered about the new CEO, about his calm demeanor, his sharp eyes, and the unsettling realization that he had once been mistaken for a customer to be watched rather than respected. Jamal, however, wasn't interested in gossip. He was focused on change, deep, structural change. The kind that couldn't be achieved through slogans or empty promises. The kind that started with accountability. In his downtown office, Jamal sat before a large whiteboard covered in notes and policies. He had spent the weekend drafting a new company initiative, one that would define how every employee, manager, and executive was expected to treat not only customers but one another. It wasn't about punishment, it was about culture. Respect, fairness, empathy. These would no longer be optional. They would be the foundation. But Jamal knew one thing: not everyone would welcome change, especially those who benefited from the old ways. At the top of his list was Rick, the clerk who had followed him like a shadow through the store. Jamal had learned much more about him since their last encounter. HR files showed multiple customer complaints, all dismissed without investigation. His store had one of the highest turnover rates in the district, and his direct supervisor had been overlooking it all, too focused on numbers to notice the human cost. Jamal didn't want to simply fire Rick. That would be too easy, too forgettable. He wanted him to see the impact of his actions, to understand what it felt like to stand on the other side of prejudice. So Jamal decided to call for a full district training summit, mandatory for every store manager and clerk. The theme, seeing beyond stereotypes. It would include personal stories, educational segments, and an unexpected exercise that would hit close to home. When the day arrived, employees from across the city gathered at a rented conference hall. The atmosphere was tense, filled with chatter and suspicion. Rick showed up too, clearly uncomfortable in his wrinkled uniform shirt, shifting nervously among co-workers. He tried to act casual, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. He knew he was under scrutiny. Then Jamal stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. He introduced himself not as a CEO, but as someone who had grown up in neighborhoods like theirs, who had faced judgment before he ever had the chance to prove himself. He spoke with calm conviction, his tone both firm and compassionate. He described the subtle ways bias infects workplaces, how assumptions shape outcomes, and how dignity can be stolen in the smallest of moments. The audience listened, some nodding, some uncomfortable, some visibly reflecting. Rick, however, sat frozen. Each word seemed to press deeper into his chest. The memory of that rainy afternoon flashed in his mind. The suit, the watch, the quiet eyes watching him back as he followed Jamal through the aisles. Then came the exercise. Jamal divided everyone into groups and gave them scenarios to role play. Each participant had to take the perspective of someone they might unconsciously judge. A homeless veteran, an immigrant worker, a single mother struggling to pay bills. Rick's group drew a scenario involving a customer being accused of shoplifting based purely on appearance. As the session unfolded, Jamal quietly observed from the back. Some employees embraced the exercise, others rolled their eyes. But Rick couldn't hide the discomfort on his face. He fumbled through the scenario, stammering as his colleagues looked at him with mild annoyance. When asked to describe how it felt to be falsely accused, Rick hesitated, and then fell silent. Something inside him shifted. He remembered the look on Jamal's face that day. Not anger, not hostility, but quiet disappointment. The kind that burns far longer than rage ever could. By the end of the session, the atmosphere in the room had changed. People weren't just hearing about discrimination. They were feeling it. Jamal's message had struck a nerve, and for the first time in years, some employees began to question their own behavior. After the event, Jamal stayed behind, reviewing the feedback forms. Most were positive. A few were dismissive, but one caught his eye, written in shaky handwriting, unsigned. It read, "I didn't realize how much harm a look can cause until today. I followed someone once because I assumed they didn't belong. Turns out I was wrong. I see it now." Jamal knew exactly who had written it. He didn't need to say anything. The lesson had landed. But Jamal's work wasn't done, because as he dug deeper into company culture, he uncovered something even more troubling, an internal pattern of bias that extended beyond individual stores. Certain neighborhoods received fewer investments, fewer upgrades, fewer training hours. The justification had always been lower performance. But now, Jamal could see it clearly: systemic neglect rooted in unspoken prejudice. He realized this wasn't just about Rick or one store. It was about rebuilding a company's conscience. And as he looked out the conference window that night, the city lights shimmering against the dark, Jamal knew the reckoning had only just begun. What started as one man's quiet humiliation would soon grow into a revolution of accountability, one that would shake the entire corporation from the ground up. But there was still one final lesson that needed to be taught, a lesson that would come when the tables turned completely. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of a quiet but powerful transformation. What had started as a company-wide diversity initiative soon became something deeper, a mirror held up to everyone who worked there. Some employees welcomed the change. Others resisted it, feeling exposed by the light Jamal had brought into the shadows. Jamal worked tirelessly. He visited stores across the state, met with local managers, and reviewed performance metrics. Everywhere he went, he could see the same pattern. Stores in wealthier, mostly white neighborhoods received better funding and modern equipment, while stores in working class or minority areas were neglected. It wasn't official policy, but it was real. It lived in the small decisions, the overlooked budgets, and the quiet biases that shaped the company's history. Jamal wasn't just trying to fix a broken business. He was trying to rewrite a culture that had been poisoned by years of assumptions and inequality. Meanwhile, at the Maple Street store, the changes were impossible to ignore. Rick was no longer the man he once was. The training session had shaken something loose in him, a recognition he couldn't easily bury. He found himself replaying that day in his head, remembering how Jamal had walked calmly through the aisles, how he himself had followed, suspicious and self-righteous. The image haunted him. Every time a customer of color entered the store, Rick felt the weight of his own past behavior pressing down on him. He caught himself overthinking his tone, his posture, even his expressions. The habit of prejudice wasn't easy to unlearn, but guilt had become his teacher. His coworkers noticed the shift. The once arrogant clerk who barked orders now worked quietly, keeping to himself. Some whispered that the new CEO had humbled him. Others guessed that he was afraid of being fired. The truth was more complicated. Rick wasn't just afraid of losing his job. He was afraid of facing who he had been. A month later, the company hosted another district meeting, this time to discuss leadership restructuring. Jamal had been reviewing all store managers and senior staff, looking for those who truly embodied the new vision. Those who didn't, he intended to replace. Rick's direct supervisor, a man named Howard, was among those called in. Unlike Rick, Howard showed no remorse. He dismissed the company's new policies as corporate theatrics and openly complained that Jamal's leadership style was too emotional. He didn't know that Jamal had heard every word. The day of the restructuring meeting, Jamal entered the room flanked by 2 board members. The air was heavy with anticipation. Names were read, promotions announced, and terminations handed out. When Howard's name came up, Jamal's tone stayed calm, measured, but absolute. Effective immediately, Howard was being relieved of his duties. His failure to address discrimination complaints and his resistance to company reforms had made him unfit for leadership. The room fell silent. Howard's face turned pale. He sputtered excuses, trying to justify his decisions, but Jamal didn't flinch. Years of quiet humiliation had taught him that real strength wasn't loud. It was steady, deliberate, undeniable. After the meeting, Jamal asked Rick to stay behind. The man's hands trembled slightly as he approached, unsure of what was coming next. But Jamal didn't reprimand him. Instead, he spoke about accountability, about growth, about the power of reflection. He told Rick that people make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. But what mattered most was what they did after realizing the harm they caused. Rick listened silently, eyes downcast. Then Jamal made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He offered Rick a chance, not to keep his job as it was, but to earn back his dignity. Rick would attend a mentorship program the company had just launched, one focused on community engagement and ethical leadership. It was a second chance, but one that required humility and hard work. When Rick left the office that day, he didn't feel relief. He felt something heavier, the weight of responsibility. Over the next few weeks, Jamal's reforms rippled outward. New store designs, hiring practices, and sensitivity trainings were implemented. Employees began sharing their own experiences with bias, some for the first time. There were tears, uncomfortable silences, and breakthroughs. The company that once turned a blind eye to injustice was finally learning to open its eyes. But Jamal knew real change wasn't just about policies. It was about hearts, and hearts took time to heal. Still, progress came, slowly, steadily. Then, one morning as Jamal reviewed quarterly reports in his office, his assistant knocked on the door with unexpected news. There had been an incident at the Maple Street store. A teenage boy had been caught shoplifting. Store security had detained him, but the boy claimed it was a misunderstanding. The manager on duty had called the police. Jamal's stomach sank. He immediately left for the store. When he arrived, the scene was tense. A frightened 15-year-old boy stood near the counter, tears streaking his face. The officer beside him looked annoyed, ready to arrest him. Jamal's eyes shifted, and there was Rick, standing near the boy, talking to the officer with urgency in his voice. Something was different about him. His posture was protective, his tone calm but firm. He wasn't accusing the boy, he was defending him. As Jamal approached, he overheard Rick explaining that the boy hadn't tried to steal anything. The security footage showed him reaching into his pocket for bus fare when the cashier misinterpreted his movement. Jamal watched as the officer reviewed the footage, nodded, and finally released the boy. The relief on Rick's face said everything. In that moment, Jamal realized something profound. Redemption was real. People could change. As the officer left and the boy ran out of the store, Rick turned and saw Jamal standing there. Their eyes met again, the same as that rainy afternoon months ago. But this time, there was no pride, no prejudice, no bitterness. Only understanding. The man who once judged had become the one who protected. Jamal said nothing, but a quiet sense of respect passed between them. The cycle had turned. The lesson had been learned, and as Jamal walked out of the store, he knew the company, and the people within it, were no longer the same. But one final moment of reckoning was still to come, one that would test everything they had built. Months passed, and the company continued to evolve. What had once been a quiet effort at reform had now become a model of ethical business leadership. Jamal's initiative, focused on empathy, equality, and inclusion, had not only changed the culture but had also revitalized profits. Customers noticed. Communities noticed. Even the media began to notice. News outlets started covering the company's transformation, telling the story of how a once troubled retail chain turned its image around under new leadership. But what none of them knew, what only Jamal truly understood, was that behind every statistic and success story lay human stories of awakening, remorse, and redemption. Rick's was one of them. After the incident with the teenage boy, something had changed permanently in him. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. His coworkers began to respect him, not for authority, but for humility. He volunteered to help train new hires, teaching them about the importance of treating every customer with dignity. He even requested to participate in community outreach programs, visiting schools and youth centers to speak about the importance of second chances. Jamal watched from a distance, never interfering but always observing. He saw in Rick what he had always believed to be possible, that people could change if given the right opportunity and truth to confront themselves. But as life often goes, progress was soon met with a new challenge. One morning, Jamal received a call from the corporate office. A social media post had gone viral, a short video showing an argument inside one of their stores. The clip was only 20 seconds long, but it was enough to spark outrage. A customer accused an employee of racial profiling, and the employee's defensive reaction made things worse. The store was none other than the Maple Street location. Jamal's heart sank. Not again. He drove there immediately. When he arrived, he found a crowd gathered outside. Cameras, reporters, and angry customers demanding answers. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Rick was there, standing near the counter, visibly exhausted, his hands shaking slightly. As Jamal approached, Rick looked up, his face pale. "It's not what it looks like," he said quietly. Through security footage, Jamal quickly pieced together what had happened. The customer, a middle-aged man, had grown irate when asked for ID to purchase an age-restricted item. The situation escalated when another employee, not Rick, made an insensitive remark. The man pulled out his phone, started recording, and within minutes, the clip hit social media stripped of context. But what the public didn't see, what the camera didn't show, was what Rick did afterward. He stepped in, calmed the situation, and personally apologized to the customer, offering him his purchase for free and ensuring that the employee responsible was immediately disciplined. He even escorted the man outside to diffuse the tension. Still, the damage was done. The internet had its story. Now Jamal faced a crisis. The company's reputation was on the line and all eyes were on him. This was the true test of his leadership and of everything he had built. Instead of issuing a defensive statement, Jamal made a bold decision. He held a press conference, not to deny the incident, but to confront it with honesty. He explained the truth, acknowledged the mistake, and reaffirmed the company's commitment to continuous learning and accountability. He didn't name or shame the employees involved. Instead, he focused on what they were doing to make it right, including expanded anti-bias training, community town halls, and open-door policies for customer feedback. The media was stunned by his transparency. Critics who expected excuses found sincerity instead, and the public slowly began to shift their tone. Then, Jamal did something unexpected. He invited Rick to speak at a company-wide virtual meeting. Rick hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready. But when the day came, he stood before the camera, voice trembling but steady. He spoke not as a victim or a villain, but as a man who had seen both sides of injustice. He shared his story, how one act of prejudice had changed the course of his life, how his CEO had given him a second chance, and how that chance had transformed him. Tens of thousands of employees watched across the country. Some wept, others simply listened, hearts softened by the raw honesty of his words. When he finished, Jamal stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and thanked him. Not for perfection, but for courage. The applause that followed wasn't just for Rick. It was for every person in that company who had ever faced the temptation to judge, who had ever made a mistake and dared to do better. After the meeting, emails and messages flooded in from employees and customers alike. People shared their own experiences with bias, both as victims and as perpetrators. The conversation had opened wide, painful, real, but necessary. In the weeks that followed, Jamal saw the ripple effects. The Maple Street store, once a symbol of the company's flaws, had become a beacon of change. Customers felt the difference, not just in service, but in sincerity. Rick, once the face of prejudice, was now a face of redemption. But as Jamal sat in his office late one night, looking over the company's annual report, he realized something important. This journey, his journey, wasn't about revenge after all. It was about justice, about restoring balance in a world that too often forgets that people can learn, grow, and rise again. Still, one more chapter in this story remained. One final moment would bring it all full circle. A moment that would prove once and for all how far both men had come. Because sometimes karma doesn't come as punishment. Sometimes it comes as grace. The morning was quiet, almost too peaceful, when Jamal arrived at the Maple Street store. It had been a year since the viral video incident, and life had slowly returned to normal. The store now thrived under a new reputation, not as a place of scandal, but as a model of transformation. The walls were freshly painted, the aisles more organized, and the employees, once tense and divided, now worked as a team. They greeted every customer with genuine warmth, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. The entire atmosphere seemed lighter, freer. As Jamal walked through the aisles, he felt a quiet pride. The scars of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined this place. Instead, they reminded everyone how far they had come. Rick was behind the counter, reviewing some paperwork. His once harsh demeanor had softened with time. He smiled more easily now, listened more deeply, and spoke with humility that could only come from a man who had truly changed. But Jamal wasn't here for a routine visit. Today would bring a twist of fate neither man could have anticipated, one that would test everything they had learned about compassion, justice, and forgiveness. Later that afternoon, while Jamal was in a meeting upstairs, the call came through the store's emergency line. A young boy had collapsed outside in the parking lot. Panic broke out. Employees rushed to help. Customers gathered. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Rick was the first one to reach him. The boy, no older than 10, was pale and struggling to breathe. Rick froze for a split second before instincts kicked in. He remembered the basic CPR training he had taken months ago as part of the company's safety initiative. He dropped to his knees and started chest compressions, calling out for help, his voice breaking as he tried to keep the boy conscious. By the time paramedics arrived, Rick was trembling, his hands covered in dust, his face pale but determined. The boy was taken to the hospital, still breathing, but barely. Later that evening, Jamal got the call from the hospital. The boy was going to be fine. His condition had stabilized, and the doctors credited the immediate CPR as the reason he survived. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, but when the nurse mentioned the boy's name, Jamal froze. It was Rick's son, his only child. The same boy Rick had been raising alone since his wife passed away years ago. The boy who sometimes visited the store after school, the one Rick always talked about with quiet pride, and the person who had administered the CPR that saved him was none other than Jamal himself. The twist of fate was staggering. Jamal had been the one to rush out after hearing the commotion, realizing what was happening before anyone else. His medical background, though long unused, had kicked in instinctively. He hadn't known whose child it was. He hadn't thought twice, he just acted. Now, as he sat in the hospital waiting room, the weight of it all hit him. Life had come full circle, in ways neither man could have written. When Rick arrived, still shaking from shock and worry, their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Words would have been useless anyway. The air between them was heavy with years of history. Anger, regret, redemption, all collapsing into a single, silent truth. Rick sank into the seat beside him, tears welling up. He whispered something under his breath, but Jamal only nodded. There was no need for forgiveness. It had already happened long before this day. When the doctor came out to confirm the boy was stable and safe, Rick broke down completely. He turned to Jamal, his voice choked with emotion, thanking him in a trembling whisper. Jamal simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. Compassion didn't need words. In the days that followed, the story spread, not through tabloids or social media, but through quiet conversations among employees and customers. They learned what had happened, how the once resented CEO had saved the son of the man who'd once humiliated him. It was poetic justice, yes. But deeper than that, it was human. It showed that real justice isn't about revenge or humiliation. It's about restoring balance, about breaking the cycle of hate before it passes to the next generation. Rick returned to work weeks later, a changed man in every possible way. He spoke often at staff meetings about empathy and second chances. He even started a mentorship program for underprivileged youth, inspired by Jamal's example. And when his son finally came home from the hospital, Jamal stopped by to visit, not as a boss but as a friend. The company thrived under this new culture. Employees began sharing their own stories of overcoming bias and learning to see beyond color, accent, or class. The Maple Street store became known as the heart of the company, where the story of two men, one wronged, one redeemed, had rewritten the meaning of workplace equality. Years later, when Jamal finally stepped down as CEO, he left behind a legacy that could not be measured in profit margins or awards. His final speech was simple. He spoke of how success is not defined by power or status, but by what we do when life gives us the chance to make things right. He ended with a line that every employee would remember. Real change begins when forgiveness becomes stronger than pride. Rick, sitting in the front row, stood and applauded. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. As Jamal walked out of the building one last time, he looked up at the company's sign gleaming in the sunlight. The same store that once followed him like a thief now carried his vision of equality for all. The story had come full circle, from discrimination to dignity, from shame to salvation, and somewhere deep inside, Jamal knew this was never about revenge. It was about redemption, not just his, but everyone's.